In the previous two episodes, we provided a concise overview of pivotal moments in the history of this emerging nation. After viewing these episodes, you should have gained insight into the intricate process of Ukraine's formation. In 2013, this young nation was merely 22 years old. Regrettably, despite her youthful vigor and pride, Ukraine was about to face her most challenging trials. The Euromaidan, destined to be chronicled in history as the Revolution of Dignity, served as a catalyst for the profound and unavoidable crisis that lay ahead. Make sure you got yourself a cup of tea or coffee. We are starting. The complex history of Crimea traces its origins to ancient times, with Greek attempts at colonization during the Byzantine era. In the early modern period, Crimea thrived as a jewel of the Crimean Khanate, a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, predominantly inhabited by Crimean Tatars. However, the 18th century saw the Russian Empire, supported by Ukrainian Cossacks, assert control over Crimea, despite its historical disconnect from Moscow, marking the start of lengthy and challenging expansion. An intriguing aspect of this conflict was the involvement of the Cossacks, a distinct military entity within the empire at the time. Crimea held immense strategic value, particularly for securing access to the Black Sea. Their role in capturing Crimea earned the Cossacks the Kuban territory, which later evolved into a Cossack colony in the Caucasus. The history of the Black Sea Fleet, a political flashpoint for Ukraine, began with the Crimea's annexation. Over the First and Second World Wars, Crimea endured occupations by various forces, including the Red Army, the German Army, anarchists, and the Ukrainian People's Republic's military. Eventually, Soviet control was reinstated, marked by Stalin's 1944 order for the forced deportation of over 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan. Stalin used false accusations of collaborationism to justify his actions. Crimea witnessed an influx of ethnic Russians during this period. This dark chapter in the history of Crimean Tatars inspired a Eurovision-winning song in 2016 by a Ukrainian singer of Tatar descent. Notably, the song featured lines in the native Crimean Tatar language. Stalin abolished Crimea's autonomy in 1945, making it an administrative region within the RSFSR. Russification of Crimea's cities was comprehensive, including the renaming of many urban centers. In 1954, following Stalin's death, the decision to transfer Crimea from the RSFSR to the Ukrainian SSR was made. Economic and administrative factors took precedence in this decision, with geographic isolation from the mainland Russia a key consideration. Despite both Russia and Ukraine being part of the USSR, Crimea remained an unprofitable enclave for Russia within the USSR's internal administration. In 1991, following the dissolution of the USSR, Crimea underwent significant changes in its administrative structure, with Ukraine reinstating Crimea's autonomy. Simultaneously, the matter of the Soviet Union's Black Sea Fleet grew increasingly contentious, with Russia and Ukraine, among other republics, emerging as separate states on the global stage. Naval captains and admirals found themselves torn between affiliations with the Ukrainian or Russian fleets. However, the central issue revolved around the ownership of Crimea itself. It took 6 years to ultimately resolve this matter. In 1997, Ukraine and Russia signed the previously mentioned border agreement, officially recognizing Crimea as part of Ukraine. There was one exception. Along with the border agreement, a separate pact between Ukraine and the Russian Federation concerning the status and conditions of Russian troops in Crimea was also adopted. This agreement transferred control of the naval base in Sevastopol and the Gvardeyski airfield to the Russian army for a period of 20 years. In 2010, the rental agreement was extended until 2042. Dudayev's reference to the Crimea stems from developments in 1993, when political factions emerged on the peninsula with a clear object: the separation of Crimea from Ukraine and its integration into the Russian Federation. By 1994, the situation had escalated to the extent that unconstitutional presidential elections were held, resulting in the victory of Yuri Meshkov, the leader of a political bloc known as Russia. In 1995, Ukraine initiated a special operation to restore constitutional order in the region. However, during this period, Russia declined to provide military assistance to Meshkov's case, likely influenced by its challenging economic circumstances and the ongoing conflict with Ichkeria. The Revolution of Dignity culminated in Lenin fall, a symbolic rejection of Soviet symbols by Ukraine's populace. This event prompted new legislation acquainting Soviet symbols with those of Nazi Germany, resulting in their prohibition. The Communist Party of Ukraine faced dissolution and was declared illegal. Concurrently, Russian propaganda launched an aggressive campaign to discredit Ukraine's anti-communist movement, framing it as a power grab reminiscent of early 20th century. Russian media outlets, particularly major television channels and news sources, amplified this narrative. Their overarching message sought to draw parallels between Ukraine's modern national movement and 20th century national liberation movements, going as far as labeling them as Nazis. While Ukrainian insurgent army indeed clashed with the Red Army, credible historical records fail to establish any connections between this movement and the German Nazis. Russia, however, resorted to distorting facts and fabricating connections without historical basis. While mainland Ukraine viewed such television stories skeptically, in Crimea they were embraced as close to reality. Unlike other regions, Crimea held the Berkut in high esteem, considering them heroes. Russia's choice to target Crimea for its military intervention was based on three critical factors: the strategic presence of the Russian naval base, a substantial pro-Russian populace, and the relative autonomy of the region. On the fateful day of February 22, 2014, the actual occupation of Crimea was set into motion. Russian military forces, including those already stationed in Sevastopol and additional troops at the Russian army-controlled Gvardeyski airfield, left their bases without Ukrainian authorization. Their mission was clear: to seize the control of administrative institutions, including the Crimean parliament, and to establish a blockade around Ukraine's military installations. Adding to the clandestine nature of this operation, Russian forces had notably removed any identifying marks or insignias from their uniforms and equipment. The Russian command was fully cognizant of the fact that their actions would be viewed as a blatant aggression according to the UN resolution. In a calculated move, they simultaneously orchestrated massive anti-Maidan rallies and demonstrations in favor of a Russian Crimea in cities like Sevastopol and Simferopol. Russian propaganda worked overtime to propagate narratives that aimed at justifying this aggression, chiefly by asserting that Kiev had been taken over by Banderite fascists. On the day when news of unidentified troops in Crimea began to circulate worldwide, as stock realization swept through most of the mainland Ukraine, the nation was on the brink of war. These unfolding events sent shock waves across the country, turning former allies into adversaries. And it happened at the time when Ukraine needed support the most, leaving it feeling betrayed. The Ukrainian military stationed at bases in Crimea found themselves prepared for such a scenario, as Kyiv had dominated the attention throughout the preceding winter. Nevertheless, they remained resolute and swiftly issued combat alerts in military units and command centers. Troops were mobilized to reinforce their bases. Notably, a poignant display of defiance occurred at the Bolbak airfield, home to Ukrainian military aircraft. Unarmed Ukrainian military personnel marched proudly under the fluttering Soviet and Ukrainian flags. Accompanied by patriotic songs and the national anthem, they faced off against the unknown military personnel, blocking the runway, a symbolic act of resilience in the face of mounting uncertainty.
Я тоже местный. Я тоже местный.
Я рад вас здесь видеть, но почему с оружием?
Почему с оружием? Потому что провоцируют.
А вы российский военнослужащий?
Нет.
Какой? А что вы здесь делаете?
While the armed militant claimed to be acting under the banner of Crimean self-defense, their true identity as Russian military personnel was glaringly evident. They were equipped with the Russian firearms and state-of-the-art military vehicles of the Tiger class, the latest creations from the Russia's military arsenal. Some of these vehicles even bore Russian license plates, designating them as part of the 21st region of the Russian Federation, especially from Cheboksar. Additionally, Ukrainian officers, in interviews with news outlets, disclosed that they frequently recognized their adversaries. These were individuals they had encountered numerous times during joint military exercises. It was not uncommon for Russian and Ukrainian sailors to mingle in the bars of Sevastopol. Now, however, they found themselves on opposite sides of the barricades.
Вы должны понимать, что нелегитимное правительство в Киеве, пришедшее к власти путем военного переворота, отдает вам преступные приказы, направляя вас против своего народа.
Despite numerous appeals to surrender their arms, the Ukrainian military stood resolute at their posts. There were incidents involving unauthorized entries onto some military bases by young men clad in tracksuits and masks, seemingly attempting to provoke the Ukrainian forces into action. Nonetheless, the military maintained their composure, effectively repelling these intrusions without resorting to the use of weapons. On February 26, Simferopol witnessed a massive rally compressing thousands of Crimean Tatars, who came out in support of Ukraine. Their demonstrations was a direct protest against the Russian proxies and the pro-Russian party in Crimea, known as Russian Unity. This event was marred by several clashes and altercations with pro-Russian demonstrators. On February 27, in mainland Ukraine, there was an urgent summon for mobilization specialists who were tasked with conducting military trainings to prepare for the reinvigoration of the armed forces. The interim government in Kyiv was acutely aware of the necessity for countermeasures. It was evident that Russia's ambitions extended beyond Crimea, and decisive action was imperative. Rebuilding the military was a pressing concern, especially given that it had been significantly downsized to just 160,000 personnel in 2013. Despite Ukraine's population of 42 million and its vast territory spanning 600,000 square kilometers. On February 28, the operation to seize Crimea entered its second phase, as the missile cruiser Moscow, accompanied by 2 corvettes, blocked the exit from Danuzlo Bay, where some Ukrainian naval vessels had been stationed. On March 1st, Russian President Putin addressed the Federation Council, seeking authorization to deploy troops into Ukraine. The Federation Council granted this request through a vote. Subsequently, on March 3rd, at the United Nations, Russian representative Vitaly Chukin read a letter purportedly from Ukraine's then acting president Yanukovych. It's worth noting that the authenticity of this document remains a subject of dispute.
To say the following. The President of Russia has received the following from President Yanukovych, and I quote the statement of the President of Ukraine. As a legitimately elected representative, I say that the events in my place and the events in Kiev have resulted in the fact that Ukraine is on the brink of a civil war. In the country, there is chaos and anarchy. The life, the security, and the rights of people, particularly in the southeast part in Crimea, are being threatened. So under the influence of Western countries, there are open acts of terror and violence. People are being persecuted for language and political reasons. So in this regard, I would call on the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, asking him to use the armed forces of the Russian Federation to establish legitimacy, peace, law and order, stability, and defending the people of Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych, 1st of March, 2014. So, colleagues, I have an opportunity to show all of you a photocopy of the original of this statement of the President of Ukraine. I show it to the President of Russia, and there it is.
Throughout March, the situation remained tense. On March 16th, a so-called referendum took place, orchestrated more as a special operation to legitimize Russia's actions. Official TV channels announced an unblushable 95-97% vote in favor of joining Russia. These figures raised doubts, especially considering the large rallies in support of Ukraine. Subsequently, the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people revealed that only about 30% of the Crimean population participated in the referendum, with only 50% of these voters supporting Russia. On March 18, in the opulent Kremlin Palace, Putin and the leader of the pro-Russian forces in Crimea signed a treaty formally incorporating Crimea into the Russian Federation. On March 20th, the Russian State Duma ratified this treaty. These developments had a profound impact on Ukraine's military presence in Crimea, which had been holding out in their bases. Base by base, they began to surrender. On the same day, Ukraine's interim president, Turchinov, announced a partial mobilization in response to the annexation of Crimea and Russia's armed conflict against Ukraine. The announced number of reservists to be called up was 15,000. On March 19th, a forceful assault on the Ukrainian Navy base took place, and the captains of the ships made a critical choice to sail into the bay to prevent the vessels from falling into the hands of proxy Russian forces. In a daring move, one of the ships attempted to break through the blockade, but tragically capsized in the process. The blockade, orchestrated by Russian Navy forces, persisted until March 25, with some ships and their captains surrounding during the first days. Several ships were seized by the Russian military during assault operations, which included the deployment of special forces aboard boats and Mi-35 helicopters. Notably that the ship called Cherkasy held the longest. Questions still linger regarding why these ships were not ordered to leave Crimea before the blockade, especially when it became evident that Crimea was on the brink of falling. This decision, or lack thereof, remains a subject of debate among Ukrainian politicians and military officials. On March 1, 2014, the UN convened an emergency meeting on Ukraine. The UN Security Council swiftly responded, vehemently defending Ukraine's territorial integrity, citing the Budapest Memorandum mentioned in the first episode. The core issue for the international community was the violation, both de facto and de jure, of the 1975 Helsinki Agreement on the inviolability of borders. This transgression, occurring in the heart of Europe, could not be ignored, as not by experts and political scientists. Foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland voiced staunch support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, outlining their nation's stances on the Crimea situation and condemning Russia's actions. However, German Chancellor Merkel's response was ambiguous. Her position primarily focused on the prevention of hostilities.
Occupation or annexation of Crimea, whatever you can talk, it's also no-go. We will never recognize that. It's clear as it is.
The Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs unambiguously characterized all Russian actions in Crimea as meticulously orchestrated operation, with the intent of deceitfully annexing another country's territory. Lithuania took further steps by summoning the Russian ambassador to voice its strong protest and deep concern regarding Russia's actions in Crimea. Unexpectedly, even for Russia, Belarusian President Lukashenko initially issued a statement in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity. However, he later de facto and de jure recognized Crimea as Russian territory, contending that Ukraine had effectively ceded Crimea. US President Barack Obama firmly sided with Ukraine and issued a stern warning to Russia against any actions that would compromise Ukraine's territorial integrity, emphasizing that such actions could carry grave consequences for Russia itself. The nature of those consequences was not explicitly stated. Simultaneously, the US ambassador to the UN Security Council asserted that Russia's intervention in Crimea lacked any legal foundation. On March 16th, Russia's primary state TV channel took an unprecedented step since the collapse of the USSR, broadcasting tweets directed at the United States and NATO, including threats of nuclear conflict. This was widely perceived as a response to Obama's earlier warnings. Concurrently, peace marches occurred in Moscow and St. Petersburg, organized by liberal groups, opposition figures, and concerned citizens. These rallies protested Putin's actions, which were seen as pushing Russia perilously close to initiating a new conflict in Europe. On March 27, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity with overwhelming support. The resolution received 100 favorable votes, with 58 countries abstaining and only 11 opposing it. Some states issued statements in support of Russia's action in Crimea, including North Korea, Cuba, Syria, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Afghanistan at that time. Additionally, the following countries voted against the resolution: Belarus, Armenia, Bolivia, Zimbabwe, and Sudan. Some countries and international organizations took more than just verbal actions in response to Russia's intervention. NATO was among the first to act, with the Secretary General announcing a revision of the NATO-Russian program and the suspension of all existing joint missions. Instead, NATO intensified its cooperation with Ukraine.
Russia must stop its military activities and its threats.
Furthermore, the Canadian government promptly expelled Russian military officers from Canada. The European Union also responded by imposing personal sanctions on individuals involved in the Crimean operation. In addition to these measures, Russia faced consequences on the international stage. Due to its aggression, Russia was excluded from the Group of 8, and since then, this international club has operated in the G7 format. After the operation to capture and annex Crimea, Russia returned the detained ships in Donuzlav to Ukraine and allowed those who wished to return to mainland Ukraine. In 2015, it was reported that out of 18,000 soldiers, only 4,000 chose to return to Ukraine, while the Russian Black Sea Fleet was bolstered by 9,200 units. This can be largely attributed to Ukraine's relatively subdued response, as they essentially abandoned ground operations against Russian forces in Crimea, anticipating the formidable threat they would face in the near future. At the time, Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Igor Tenyukin, stated that only 5,000 combat-capable and loyal soldiers could be rapidly assembled from the entire army. His statement was quite explicit. "We can deploy them to Crimea, but this won't solve the Crimean problem. We will just place them there. What about the thousands of kilometers of border and Russia's preparations for invasion? If they come from the Chernihiv region in the morning, they will reach Kiev by evening." Ukraine neglected the development of the cultural and political aspects concerning the Crimean Tatar people in Crimea, which had significant consequences. As a result, pro-Russian elements came to dominate the political and criminal spheres in the region. However, despite this, authentic Crimean Tatars remain resolutely opposed to Russia. Mustafa Jamilov, a prominent Crimean Tatar leader, emphasized the situation by stating, "The number of Crimean Tatars holding Russian passports can be counted on one hand. Crimea is occupied, and we do not accept it." The Russian military personnel involved in the operation were later awarded a medal for a return of Crimea, bearing the operation's start date, February 20, 2014. Ukrainian politicians now point to this date as the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian War. Additionally, the presence of dated metal provides a significant clue regarding the time frame when the operation to annex Crimea was fully planned. It is evident that the planning was already in its advanced stages by no later than the January 2014, considering the minimum lead time required to produce such medals, explained a retired Soviet military officer. The future of the peninsula remains a matter of perspective, with some residents experiencing improved living conditions under Russian rule, while others have seen their situation worsen. Approximately 10,000 Crimean Tatars left Crimea due to political reasons. Mainland Russians also migrated to the peninsula, attracted by the lower real estate prices, while entrepreneurs sought to capitalize on new opportunities. It's undeniable that Russia acquired Crimea through coercive means, asserting control over the territory as an imperial power.